Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Stephen Haberman, Dean of Cass Business School. Welcome to Cass. Welcome to this Dean's Lecture, which we're holding in conjunction with the school's Mergers and Acquisitions Research Centre. Whenever a dean stands up in front of a microphone, he tends to talk, or she tends to talk about their school. So since I have a captive audience, I'm going to take 2 minutes just to tell you something about Cass for those of you who are here for the first time. So, over the last 10 years, this school has been on an upward trajectory so that we're now in the top 3 or 4 in the UK and the top 15 in Europe. We are what is called a full-service business school. We have over 3,600 students studying at undergraduate level, master's level, MBA level, PhD level, and that includes specialist masters covering a range of disciplines and courses which are of a general nature, like our full-time and executive MBA. Our degree programs have some cross-cutting themes, and one that I would just mention is for many years now we've had a deep interest in ethics and the role of business and society, and these are subjects that feature in virtually all of the degree courses that we run. It seems to me this is an exciting time for Cass. I mean, it's not just because I'm the Dean, obviously that makes it exceptionally exciting, but it's a time of investment. We have invested in 30 new outstanding members of academic staff who have joined us in the last couple of years. Many of these are world-class academics with outstanding research reputations, professional experience, and large networks in the practitioner community. And we've just opened a new corporate-facing premises in Aldersgate, just by the Museum of London. And this is now the home for our Executive MBA and our Executive Education programs. And it provides a dedicated state-of-the-art space for all of those executive activities. One thing about business schools is the range of league tables and rankings that bedevil us. And I'm going to be very selective, as I'm allowed to be, and just quote a few if you don't mind. So just to give you some idea of our global standing, our research in finance is ranked number 3, not by us but by independent commentators. It's ranked number 3 in Europe. Our banking research is ranked number 2 in Europe. Our research in actuarial science and insurance is ranked number 2 in the world. And one that I'm particularly proud of is our research has been ranked number 2 in Europe for its impact on the world of practitioners and policymakers. We have traditionally worked very closely with the professional service and financial services industries, but we've more recently developed a close relationship with our neighbours in Tech City, and this is something that we're seeking to develop and strengthen further. So there's a link there with our speaker this evening. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mike Lynch, described by one pundit as the UK's Bill Gates. So let me tell you just a little bit about him. He grew up in Essex, and I'm always pleased to welcome an Essex boy to Cass, as one myself. He studied natural sciences and electrical sciences at Cambridge. He ran his first business from his dormitory room, making components for synthesizers, and some of us are old enough to remember what those were. He founded Cambridge Neurodynamics, which then morphed into Autonomy, a very successful business which itself has spawned other businesses. He's won many awards. I don't have enough time to go through them all, but I'm going to select a few. The outstanding contribution to IT from the British Computer Society, CBI's Entrepreneur of the Year in 1999, the European Business Leaders Award for Innovation in 2008, Management Today's Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2009. He's a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. He's been awarded the OBE for his services to enterprise. He's a trustee of the British Library, and he has many advisory roles and positions, and in particular sits on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. You're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Mike. So I'm about to hand over to him, but let me just tell you the format. The format is that Mike is going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A chaired by my colleague Scott Muller, who's Director of the Mergers and Acquisitions Research Centre. Mike's title is Building a Brilliant Business. Over to you, Mike.
Well, good evening, everyone. I have the slight advantage of being able to come and talk to you tonight, whilst not being CEO of some public company or in charge of some division of the government, which means that I have a wonderful luxury, which is actually becoming very rare in the modern world, is that I can actually tell you what I think without a PR department that's going to get very upset or worried about how whatever I say will play into the legacy I'm carefully crafting in my business book. That's hopefully still a few years away. So what I wanted to do was just tell you about my journey and what I've learnt. Some of it I hope you'll find insightful. Some of it you'll probably be quite offended by because it might not fit with your model. But it's something which is just what I've come across. And then what you can do is take this and make of it as you will. I've been on quite a journey because I started as an academic. I was at Cambridge researching how to get computers to understand the world around them. That's a fascinating area because it's all to do with perception, and you can actually argue that everything we as a conscious human understand around the world, about our world, comes through our ability to do perception. And one of the interesting little connections to where we're sitting today is that that's a subject which is being rewritten by the work of someone called the Reverend Thomas Bayes, and he lived 250 years ago, and his work is now informing the most advanced research in the area. So it's taken the rest of us 250 years to catch up with him. But the connection is that he's actually buried in Bunhill Fields. So he's just up the road here. So with a little bit of respect to the Reverend Thomas, we'll talk about all of the things that are going on. So as I said, I started two people in a college flat. In those days, I was doing synthesizers. This was the beginning of the 80s. Most wonderful period in music, in my opinion, doing the synthesizers. And the problem was that these were actually probably, I think, the most advanced objects on the planet at the time, in that they made the sound in software, and they had to have the very fastest processors and multiple processors. And of course, when a musician does something, it's got to happen then. It's all real time, very, very complex. In fact, it was so complex that the only way we could make the prototypes was to get the missiles that were designed for the very front end of, the chips that were designed for the very front end of missiles. And the problem is that these things cost a fortune, and we couldn't really afford them. So I learnt my first bit of business skill was I rang up the sales director of the company that made these missile chips, and I had a discussion with him about the chip that I needed to get one of in order to make a prototype. And at the end, I just said, and what would the price be for 10,000 of those then? And there was a sudden silence while he reached for the new Porsche catalogue at the end of the phone. Suddenly he was going to be my helpful friend. And I just added on the end, and could you send me one for our QA department? Now, the important thing to understand about the operation at this time was it was two students in a student flat above a kebab shop in Cambridge. But luckily, the next day or two came a little packet, beautifully packed, with one of these processors. And we went ahead and we built our prototype, and eventually the technology became the centre of a synthesizer, which actually went on to get lots of number one hits. The plan worked beautifully apart from one thing, which is I did too good a job. And the doorbell went at about 11:30 one morning, and I fell out of bed, as you do when you're a PhD student in engineering. And I went down, still in a dressing gown. I opened the door, and there was this delegation from the company, all in business suits. And they said, we're looking for Mike Lynch. And I said, I've never heard of him. I don't know. But anyway, things moved on from there. So, fascinating thing about not being in the position that many of you are, and that you all have some degree of business knowledge and obviously learning great things here, was that I learned everything about business on the job. And when I started a company, decided that I could use some of the PhD work that I'd done to actually make a business, I went along to the bank and I said, I've got this sort of local bank manager, and I said, I've got this wonderful way of decomposing sparse spaces in singular values over multiple dimensions. And they looked at me a bit confused, and I explained that normally he did things like small business loans for people that were sort of starting in newsagents and that sort of thing. And he told me that people often buy sweets on the way to and from work and things like that. And so what I'm doing now is amassing sufficient funds so that I can buy all the newsagent shops in the world and use his advice and take over everything. Anyway, he didn't give me any money. And so I went through various things, tried to get some money from government schemes. That didn't work. Bizarrely, in those days, the government schemes seemed to delight in quirky technology. I remember it was done regionally, and the regional winner in our region, and remember this had Cambridge in it, was a chap who made a bicycle that you could cycle across a lake in. Very strange. And I met the chap who was in charge of this, and he there was a whole thing on innovation. He sat me in his room and he said, so what are you doing, young man? And I said, I'm doing this. And he said, well, I'm only doing innovation because I retire in 2 months' time, so they've given me innovation to do. And what you realized was that there was a fundamental cultural disconnect between the reality of what was going on in people trying to create businesses back then and what the government mechanisms could understand in doing that. And of course we saw some very big mistakes in terms of government trying to pick winners back then. So got the business founded. Obviously that grew, became a FTSE 100 and got sold to Hewlett-Packard for 11 billion. It spun off other businesses like Blinks, which is now a $1 billion business. The interesting thing for me, though, is how I've learnt the skills that I didn't have. And the first big problem you have when you start as a technical person is your whole education is about believing that the best thing will win. If you build that best mousetrap, then it will win. And pretty soon you realise that it's not working like that. That the world is dominated by the effects of marketing. People are not necessarily interested in what's best. There's all sorts of different reasons why different people are interested in things. And you start having to learn the hard way how to actually take something that's a complex idea, and although it may be right, explain it in a way which allows someone to grab onto an idea and run with it. And you learn it by experience, and you just end up interacting with people. You see what they get and what they don't get and what little memes they can work with. And then what you have to do is accept the difference between the reality and the positioning. I'll give you an example. I got an introduction looking for funding to a New York billionaire. And this chap had made his fortune in video distribution. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant until I went to his office, but some of his titles, I could understand what he was distributing as I walked past them. And I sat opposite him, and I explained this great piece of technology I had. And he got more and more sort of irritated and obviously wanted to go off and do something else. And I was explaining about how you get computers to recognize things. And eventually, his accountant, who, the two of them also worked together for 50 years or something, just turned to him and he said, "Joe, it works like the brain." And it was a very important moment for me because as a scientist, I sat there and I thought, my God, no one knows how the human brain works. It's a great unsolved mystery. And then I realized the correct answer was, yeah, Joe, it's just like the human brain. And do you know what he said to me? He said, "Why didn't you just say that?" But the important point was that it's all very well having great technology, but you've got to have great marketing. And this is a big issue with a lot of the Cambridge companies I deal with, where the technology is astounding and they think that marketing is cheating. It's not cheating. You've got to actually go and do that. So let's talk about all the way back then. Well, one of the interesting things when you start in business is that I had the luxury of starting with naivety. And naivety is a wonderful thing because if you don't know all the problems about how you're going to do something, you start it. Now, you may hit a problem down the road, but you actually start. And one of the interesting things I'm seeing in my life at the moment is that I now have the most wonderful management team around me who grew autonomy over the years, and we've worked together for 10 years. And they're one of the best technology management teams in the industry because they've been together and they've gone all the way through. And we have someone comes in with a great idea and presents it to us. And as they leave the room, I will get the most amazing rundown of why this idea won't work and what all the problems are going to be. And of course, they're right. Everything they say is right because they're brilliant at analysis and they understand the space and everything. But there's a fundamental problem, which is they're never going to start something because they can always see the difficulties. And so the most important thing about starting something with vision is not to be too analytical. You will not start anything if you analyse it to hell. And more importantly, the only thing you have any hope of starting is the one which minimises risk. And the issue here is not minimising risk, it's risk for return. So be very, very careful of the modern corporate culture, which is all about over-analysis. Sometimes you have to have a leap of faith. And one little trick I've found is separate the two. Have 10 minutes of your meeting, which is about why this idea will work. What's the upside here? Why would we do this? Then have 10 minutes about why it will never work. But you keep them separate. Because the reality is it's always easier to stamp on the seedling. It's always easier to say why something won't work rather than why it will. So what you've got to do is you've got to clear space for people to think the unthinkable, for people to think about what this could be if it happens. And then if you have that naivety, you at least start. And the biggest problem I see at the moment is people don't start because they can see why things won't work. It's actually a big problem for serial entrepreneurs. They've gone in, they've hit the ball out of the park, they're worried they're not going to do it next time. Well, you've got to. You've got to get there, you've got to give it a go. What other things have I learned? Well, focus. Focus is everything. Now, technology is very interesting in that quite often you sort of open a newspaper and you find that some companies raised $100 million, some startup in the Valley or something. And when I read that, I immediately write the business off. And the reason is it's impossible to be focused when you have $100 million to play with. And the issue in technology is actually not money, it's time. Everything's about time. Technology is a perishable item. So what you've got to do is be completely focused on what it is you actually need to get done. And again, this is a big cultural problem because in my lifetime, you've gone from turning up in the office, pulling out a blank sheet of paper and writing down a list of what you want to do today to opening your inbox. And I bet most of you start your day by opening your inbox and working through your emails. You're completely under the control of someone else's agenda. And what's more, it's even worse than that, in that you're then sending them responses which control their agenda. And so it's really very, very important to take control of the agenda. And one of the things that I do is I just work out what are the 5 things I must get done today. And you start doing those, then you worry about the emails. And, I just wonder how much human activity is getting wasted in this sort of chain reaction of replying and sending stuff to each other when we could all be doing something more productive. And you just have to control that. And the reason we love it is it's what I call a displacement activity, in that when we've cleared our inbox, we think we've achieved something. It's an illusion. So very important to make sure that you run a business with absolute focus, worry about the fundamental problems that you need to deal with. One of the big issues here is that you'll often get told by people what you should be doing, and you need to be very sceptical about some of that. So one of the phrases I don't like is where someone says, to do it properly, you have to do X. And you see this. I go to startup companies, and there's 3 directors, and they've just spent £25,000 on their service contracts. And you think, are you crazy, £25,000 in a 3-person company? If you need service contracts that badly, you shouldn't be starting a business together. And yet that's the proper way to do it. Another nice example of that phrase is if you start dealing with a city and they talk to you about market practice, okay? That phrase means this is where you get screwed, and I'm not going to tell you how. And what it is, again, is a potted phrase which avoids people discussing what's actually going to happen. And so don't accept that something has to be done properly. Work out why it needs to be done. Work out why someone is telling you something happens that way. And this is very true in my world of technology, because what you can't assume in technology is the constancy of a previous patterning approach. So it's what psychologists call patterning. You learn how to do something, and then you repeat that. Well, in the technology world, everything changes so quickly that patterning is a very, very dangerous model to get into. You know, suddenly whole business models can change in the world. So you have to actually be thinking about things differently. Marketing. When you look at the value of a technology business, it can be decomposed into different parts. The key part is that you're actually doing something that customers need or want. That's like the same for many businesses. Obviously, you have the value of the technology and the IPR, the know-how. But actually, one of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about, technology businesses are very much dominated by their positioning. So you can take 2 technology businesses that are great names, I don't know, SAP, which is a big software company, and Oracle. The reality is, I'm pretty sure that those 2 companies could do exactly what the other one does if they really wanted to. But the point is that they've grown up with a positioning, a brand, if you like, of who they are. And the ability for them, that's both their value, but it's also their constraint. So it's very hard for technology companies to change their positioning. And this is very, very interesting. There's a very interesting example of it today. British Aerospace has just announced today that it feels it's missing out on cybersecurity, which is a big area. And it has a little company it bought for about 500 million a few years ago called Detica. And then it has British Aerospace, and one is the subsidiary of the other. And cybersecurity is often running as a big area in its own right, massive growth. And today they've announced something which I think is fascinating, which is they decided to rename Detica British Aerospace Intelligence Systems. Now, to me, that's just crazy, because you're taking the positioning of, which is generally considered a metal-bashing large defence contractor, and you're putting your cybersecurity, which is your high-growth, with-it happening thing, under that brand. You're positioning in the wrong direction, not the right direction, because actually what you need to do in that situation is you need a positioning which is completely different to where the brand is. So these issues about marketing and positioning in the technology world, basically because it's so noisy, really, really crucial. The next one is, this is what I call the hungry wolf. And wolves are rather magnificent predators, but actually when it gets to the dead of winter and they can't find anything, they will eat lichen off of rocks. And one of the things that I find fascinating in the world is how people won't do a U-turn. They won't actually just decide that they need to react to what's going on. And so quite often in the technology world, people will decide they're doing something and then they will steadfastly follow that to destruction. In a world where you've got a series of hypotheses to start with and then it's all changing around you, The idea that you're actually going to have a plan which is in any way correct is lunacy. And what actually is happening is, as you're running your business and going out and talking to customers and trying to do deals, you're getting continual information back, and the world is changing around you. So what you should be able to do is you have to create an approach where there's absolutely no problem about doing a U-turn. Now, some of the structures are not very good here. So, for example, if you're a small company, you get a venture capitalist, you sell the venture capitalist on your great plan, and your venture capitalist comes to each board meeting. It's very hard to say, you know what we told you? No. We're not going to do that, we're going to do this. But actually, that's exactly what has to happen for businesses to be successful. I have seen almost no examples of a business that's been successful that followed its original plan. So the important thing here is adaptability and creating a culture where it is absolutely acceptable to say, no, we're going to do this differently, we're going to take a U-turn, we're going to do things. Now, the one interesting problem in that is the public markets. Because the public markets really are all set up that you're supposed to tell them what you're going to do, and then you do it. The idea that actually you're going to create shareholder value by telling them what you're going to do and then you're going to go and do that, very, very difficult. In fact, senior management generally, unless they're very good at it, find it very hard to survive those kind of turns. Now, you can argue that's very good for smaller companies and it gives them the opportunity, but it is actually a fundamental problem with the public market model at the moment in these very highly volatile situations. Key one for technology. Always take a gun to a knife fight. Don't even think about starting something unless you have an unfair advantage. Cheat in terms of the technology. And the reason for this is when you start doing something, there will be some kind of incumbent in the marketplace. They will have customers, they will have a sales force, they will have a brand, they may have more access to finance. To start something, you have to have a massive advantage. That will get widowed down by the time you actually get the product to market, by the time it's marketed, all of those problems. If you don't do that, it's incredibly difficult to actually be successful. And one of the obvious mistakes you see a lot is people doing a Me Too idea. So, I still actually do see people trying to launch, sugary, fizzy water drinks. In fact, the latest one I saw was about a month ago where it has a QR code on the side. That's the big differentiator. The important point here is Facebook has done it. You can't do Facebook again. It's done. It's won. It's gone. And what that means is if you're defining your business in terms of current players, although that's very reassuring, it's probably the wrong thing because you haven't got that absolute differentiation. Now, there is a slight warning here. Of course, I'm talking about my journey. If we had Luke Johnson here, who did Pizza Express, he'll tell you how to run a business on very little margin, selling something that pretty much everyone else can sell. But I don't know how to do that, so I always have to have an unfair advantage. And it seems like a much easier way to go than trying to do things. Another interesting one is don't get drawn into his kind of fight. So one of the fascinating things that I've noticed over the years is how people define themselves in terms of who's around the landscape. So if you're online at the moment, you will define yourself as like Facebook, but. And one of the fascinating decisions we had in the early days of autonomy was you could use autonomy to make a search engine. You could also do a lot more with it. Now, almost every other competitor turned up and said, we are just like Google, but. And the problem with that is you're inherently not owning anything. It's much easier because people say, oh, you're like Google. But actually, you don't get anywhere by doing that. And this is, I've become very convinced about this point. It's counterintuitive because you don't have the shorthand for explaining what you do. But provided you actually have something, you end up owning something and having value. And I got into a very heated debate with this with a professor of marketing from Northwestern University, and he got very hung up on the concept of communication, so it's easier to explain things in terms of what people understand. My point is that's absolutely true, but the question is, what do you get for it? Do you actually get something that you own at the end of it? So this is why I think people make this mistake of being drawn into someone else's fight. Remember, the someone else is probably quite good at their fight. That's why they're there. So try and create your own fight. Try and create a fight that you can win, that you have the advantage on. Vision. Now, technology, again, is a world where vision is actually very important. Having spent some time at an unnamed Fortune 1000 recently, I've become convinced that vision is actually very important, even for very large companies. Now, vision in technology is a sort of mystical thing. I sort of came across it by accident in that I'm actually deaf. And so in this situation, what happens when we come to the questions is that you'll ask a question, I'll try and lip read it, and what I will end up with is, why does the aardvark like sharks? And so at that point, my brain is desperately running through all the possible things that could sound like shark at the end, and aardvark, to try and work out what's going on. Now, what this inherently means is you ask a question, I do this sort of thing, and then I look into the corner while I'm desperately trying to work out what you just said. And what I didn't realise was that giving an unrelated answer after looking into the corner for a while makes you a visionary. Try it, it works. And so people start to believe that you have some sort of strange insight into the world, and of course, very important to play with that. But why is vision important? Well, companies, the sort of companies I work in, are all about the people. That's the asset, it's the people. And people want to believe that they are making a difference. They want to believe that they matter. We have a civilization in the West which is all about the fact that the individual matters. And so they want to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And vision is incredibly important. And remember, in the technology world, your good motivated software engineer is worth 100 times your mediocre unmotivated one. We have a situation where there's this massive gearing effect. So being able to have a vision and articulate it is incredibly, incredibly important. It also works the other way around in that when I was autonomy, we had a competitor, and the competitor used to do things that weren't very nice. And we found that actually the whole company grew together and was so wanted to beat this competitor that it was incredibly motivating. And people actually were fired up. They wanted to make something happen. And that was all because of creating a culture where they believed in the vision, they believed that they were doing something right, and then there were all of these sort of trolls around them trying to get in the way. And what it meant was that you could get things achieved that wouldn't have been possible any other way, because people were really trying to make it happen. So let's talk about people. Most of the businesses or things that I've been involved with, all the way from the BBC to autonomy, the asset is the people. And the most interesting thing I learned about people is crossover is what matters. So at Cambridge, I go up to sometimes give a talk at the Judge, and at the end of it, the MBA class will come up, and of course, little groups of them will want to tell me what their new idea is for their business. And what I get is a little group of almost identical MBA students, and they'll have some crazy idea, I don't know, toothpasteyourdoor.com or something like that. And the idea is no good. They present it brilliantly. And what I say to them is, 50 yards across the road is the engineering department. Yes, they don't wash. It's true. Yes, they're not trendy. But they're doing amazing things, and they don't know how to run a business, and they don't know how to market it. Why aren't you going over there and meeting them? Because Your drive to start a business and your knowledge of marketing combined with their amazing bit of technology would be incredible. But as humans, we tend to like to hang around people who are like us. And in business, that's the wrong way to do it. Hang around with people who are just not like you at all, and then what you get is an orthogonal set of skills that come together. And collect those people, and what you do is you create an amazing management team. An amazing management team where people have different skills and attributes. But you've got to realise that it's that diversity which is making things happen. What are the management mistakes? Well, I always like the analogy here is, I don't know if you remember the old airplane films, but the basic premise here was airliner, various passengers, you got to see a little bit of their life, a nun with a guitar, all that stuff. And then inevitably something awful happens in the cockpit. And the pilot gets sucked out or poisoned or something. And for some reason, the only possible person who can land the plane is the flight attendant. And she's called Cheryl or something like that. And so she sits down there. And I love this woman because she is exactly what I like in a new manager. And that she sits down and she puts on the headphones and she says, "What do I do now?" And they say, "Press the red button." "You want me to press the red button?" "Yes." "I'm pressing the red button." "Have you pressed the red button?" "I've pressed the red button." And do you know what? The plane lands, everyone's safe and happy and hugs, right? This is what happens when some of your more cocky MBAs start running stuff. Why do people have to believe they have to make out they know how to do things? One of the most freeing things is to admit, I don't have a clue. And it's very, very important in the technology world because you know what? Despite all those column inches that get written all those analyst reports, no one actually knows what's going to happen. And so what you have to do is have a very open mind and be listening and learning and doing things. And if you get that situation where you're in that plane and you sit down, first of all, nothing wrong in saying that you don't know and you're learning. And then you do that and see what happens. And you do that and you see what happens. You don't do that. And that process of being open to learning is very counterintuitive. We see CEOs turn up on CNN and they'll tell you how it's going to be, what they're seeing, what they're going to do. They don't have a clue. Trust me, I've been in those boardrooms. It's all an illusion. And what they're trying to do is react. But we have this culture where we all have to appear to be confident and know what we're doing, when actually the best way to run a business is to admit you don't know what you're doing and then hedge. So you don't know whether A or B is going to happen. You may take a weighted bet towards A, but you have a hedge for B. The person that sits there and says B is going to happen, big problem. So always it's about hedging and understanding that you don't actually know what's going to happen. A lot of your hedges will turn out to be money wasted and that won't happen, but you've always got it covered. What about managing people? Well, I work with really very good people, very talented people, very committed people. And one of the things I've found is that those kind of people you really have to look after. Remember what I was saying about a software writer being 100 to 1 in their productivity? If you get someone, whether they be the software writer or the receptionist, and that person is really trying hard to do something great, you have to look after that. You have to be prepared to reward that. And for example, British companies are very bad at this. What you don't want is an HR department that has a plan and a list. You want to be able to look after people. Now, I've had situations where I've wanted to give a bonus to a receptionist, and I've had an HR department tell me, I can't do that because we might be open to lawsuits from the other receptionists. That's crazy. Run the business first, then let HR tell you how to do what you need to do to run the business. but you've got to look after people. And the reason I use this is old television sets used to have these. So many of you are too young to remember these, but there were two knobs: brightness, which makes everything white and wonderful, and contrast, which makes the whites white and the blacks black. And in the technology world, lots of people like doing brightness. They love to turn out, everyone's great. You go to California, hey, that's just wonderful. I really appreciate what you've done there. It's just like that. And of course, as soon as everyone's out of the room, they fire each other. But it's all about the brightness. Actually, if you want to be successful, it's about the contrast. The people that are doing amazing things and making things happen at whatever level in the organisation, look after them and look after them massively. And don't let anyone, shareholders, HR, tell you that you can't do that. But at the other side of the equation, if you're out to change the world, the people that are not up to it, it's much better they go somewhere else. Someone that wants to not be interested in their job and wants to be out of the door at 5 no matter what's going on, they will be happier in a different environment. Give them that opportunity. And that means that you have to address it, though. You can't allow mediocrity in this kind of environment, because as soon as you get mediocrity, it brings the energy level down. And what you want is people that want to change the world. So controversial though it is, I'm a great believer in a little less brightness and a little bit more contrast in how you deal with people. The incumbent thing on you, though, is on the whites of the contrast. You must look after people and really appreciate their talents at a level that is beyond normal corporate structures. Because we're in a world where that leverage is incredible when it comes to what people can do for you. So let's talk a little bit about that world to finish off. There's a quote which I love because I think it's actually probably the simplest quote to understand the modern world. And the quote is from Edward Wilson, who's a biologist at Harvard. And it says that we have the emotions of the Paleolithic, and we have the institutions of the medieval, and we have the technology of the gods. The emotions, the motivations for people are exactly the same as what Shakespeare wrote about. It hasn't changed. If you read an ancient Greek play, it's exactly the same. Fear, love, hate, greed, all those sort of things. The institutions that we work in, most of them arose just after the medieval. Political institutions. And yet what's happened is that our technology is taking off at an exponential rate. It's changing the whole way in which we can cope with things. Let's just talk about people. If you were a person and you were living in a Suffolk village 1,000 years ago, nothing ever happened. About every 100 years, the Vikings turned up and caused some trouble, but apart from that, nothing happened. And what that meant was that your I/O, to use a technical term, the input-output to your brain was relatively limited. You tilled the land, and if you were a genius, if you were Albert Einstein, it was irrelevant, because all that mattered was whether you could grow enough food for the next winter. What's happened is that we've developed technologies now which massively increase the I/O bandwidth to our brain's processor. I can be on the phone to someone in San Francisco as I walk in here, and then next minute I can ring someone in Mumbai. I can collaborate with people all over the world. I can get to any piece of information I want on the internet. And what's happened as we've gone through that progression of more and more information is productivity has continued to rise. And what this has done is it means that we're more likely to find Einstein. Einstein is not going to just till the fields, but because of connectivity is more likely to be spotted. And when you have a system, it can either be I/O limited or it can be processor limited. And the human brain so far has been massively I/O limited in history. What this leads to, though, is a series of interesting effects. If I get my software writer, who's very, very good, and I put them in modern communication with the internet, with other software writers around the world, they can be 100 times more valuable than a mediocre software writer. When we were back tilling the land in the village, the best guy was probably 2 times better than the mediocre one. This is going to lead to a whole series of problems about how we assign wealth in society, how we assign value. Free market is going to lead us to some very strange places. Are we prepared to acknowledge that? How do we actually deal with the fact that that distribution is going to be forced up by technology? How do you deal with it in your business? How do you look after those key people now that the values go up? So those are the sort of complications that we're seeing. But the other big problems we're seeing is where the technology starts to interact. If you imagine the Paleolithic, the emotions, they don't change other than on evolutionary timescales. Your brain actually is no different to a brain 10,000 years ago. Whereas our institutions can change, but they change very slowly, and our technology is changing at an amazing rate. It's like having tectonic plates moving at different rates next to each other. Let me give you a very simple example, financial system. What's happening in the financial system is that you're starting to get everything happening faster. So Timothy Geithner still takes the same amount of time to get across Manhattan to shout at the bank bosses. But actually the trading is going up a factor of 10 every year in terms of speed. Okay? That's bad. Make it really bad, add feedback into the system. So feedback is for any of you engineering, if you've ever stood at a wedding with a microphone in front of the speaker and it howls, that's feedback. Well, imagine that in the financial system. And what we've done is, because we don't have anything other than medieval institutions, we're arbitrarily adding feedback all over the system, and we have no ability to control it because our political systems won't allow us to. We can't even get the information that Goldman Sachs has done a deal with the Mexican government with derivatives involved, which we might need to try and keep this feedback loop stable, because politically the Mexican government doesn't want that known. Or if we try and introduce regulation to make the system stable in London, then the political approach is, well, if we do that, the business will move to Paris. So our institute, Euro is another classic example. When the discontinuities start breaking out in the Euro, there's a whole political process to get to the point where the German Chancellor can actually do something and bring their people with them. So we've got some fundamental problems, and it's only going to get worse. We're only going to get faster, and we're only going to get more feedback loops. And the interesting thing about this world is that you have to be very careful to separate cause and symptoms. What's the cause and what's the symptom? If the patient dies because they can't breathe, did they die because they couldn't breathe, or did they die because they had a bacterial infection? And the thing about the way in which these systems are shaking themselves apart is, one day it might be CDOs, another day it might be the insurance market failing. But what you've got is fundamentally a system where you've got feedback, and feedback's counterintuitive. And what this all comes down to is a very simple example. If you drive a car and you drive it at 20 miles an hour, you can take your hands off the wheel. Because as it starts to go unstable and veer off, you can put your hands back on the wheel because you're a human. You can do that. Try doing that at 200 miles an hour and you'll die. Because the intervention model of control relies on human beings that work at a certain clock speed. We're now in the world where that's too fast for the human beings to do that. So we've got some big, big challenges. It will also lead to some big, big opportunities. So how do you make money out of this? Well, remember my quote. Always think about those 3 things. I'll give you a very simple example. Greed. So, back in the Roman days, you had the problem that something would go wrong between 2 parties and they'd have a dispute. And in a civil dispute, the 2 parties would turn up in front of the judge, and you have the base of Roman law, and they'd lay out the facts of the dispute, and the judge would apply the law and give a ruling, and you have the basis of legal system in many civilizations. Crucial to civilization. Roll on to the modern world, and the information is now terabytes. So you get a situation where to do discovery, you've got to go through terabytes. Well, you've got a very simple situation here. Either you give up on discovery, in which case, how does civilization work? Or there's a massive need for technology that can deal with that situation of transitioning to terabytes. And what this means is you can predict off of the basis of the fundamental of how people work. Another example I would say is Facebook. If you go to San Francisco, you meet loads of people. Almost everyone under 35 is not from San Francisco. Paleolithically, they're programmed to be hierarchical animals interacting in a social order. But the airplane has made that an impossibility. What you see then is the need to have a replacement social hierarchy becomes very important. So a lot of what you have to do to think about the future is think about the Paleolithic and read your history, and then try and work out how the technology changes are mapping onto those things. So just in conclusion, what am I doing at the moment? Well, I have the wonderful thing of having all my old management team back together. We've raised $1 billion, and what we're doing now is trying to be naive enough to find great technologies and bring know-how to dealing with them. And we're looking at various areas. Cybersecurity, I think, is an amazing area because it's completely unsolved. If we were an organism, we're wandering around with no immune system at all. So at the moment, the IT industry, which always will sell you whatever it can do versus what your problem is, has told you that you have to build a massive great wall around everything. So it's a bit like those beautiful Tuscan hill towns that you go on holiday to, and they've built a wall around and they close the gates at dusk. Well, two problems with that. First of all, you can't build a wall around Milan because it has to interact with everything. And secondly, everybody's already inside. So what you actually need to have is something that looks much more like a biological immune system. And because everyone's wide open without this at the moment, it's going to become a higher and higher priority. And so I love that area. It's unsolved, and there's a real business need, and what's going on at the moment isn't going to solve it. Another area is augmented reality. A smartphone now can recognize millions of objects in real time just with its camera, and it can, moreover, drop objects into the scene. When we start to get wearable devices, what that means is I'll be looking at you, and there can be a goldfish sitting there talking to me. It will look perfectly normal. I can interact with it, ask it how it's feeling. But moreover, I can just look at any product and buy it. Or I can look at any building and say, tell me the history. So this is going to be a very radical way in which we move away from text-based information again. Remember, text hasn't been around that long. In terms of our Paleolithic timescales, it's a blink of an eye. And then the last area is genetics. So there's been a lot of excitement about the ability to sequence DNA. This has just gone below the $1,000 barrier. Illumina just announced that. The fascinating thing about this is not the sequencing, because that will become a commodity, but it's the data you get from the sequencing. Cancer is fundamentally a disease where the tumour cell changes DNA. And what it does and what it can do and what tricks it can play are all dependent on that. Now you can sequence a cancer tumour, it's going to completely change the way in which we go around doing medicine, and we're going to have treatments which are completely personalised. Technology is amazing. What's the problem? The problem is the institutions and the medieval. We have a regulatory framework which is all about testing things on large numbers of people. What we've got to do is get the politicians brave enough to change it so we have a regulatory framework which acknowledges that now we've got individual treatment. That's what's holding us up, not the technology. So again, it's the same theme. So anyway, that brings me to the conclusion. As I said at the beginning, it's just my journey, and it's the way I think about things. Obviously, I'm the product of a very particular sector in the economy, but I hope, coming back to my concept of first principles, I've at least given you something to think about next time you're in the bath. Thank you very much.